Hello folks, welcome to Eye on Nature. This is a show dedicated to inspiring people about nature, and we're glad you're here. I'm Scott Heth. I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental Learning Centers of Connecticut. This program is brought to you by Nutmeg TV. We're glad to be here in the Nutmeg Television studios, and also by the Environmental Learning Centers of Connecticut. And we have the Indian Rock Preserve in Bristol, Connecticut, on the Wolcott line of Bristol, right on 69. We also have the Harry C. Barnes Memorial Nature Center, which is on Shrub Road, also in Bristol, on the Burlington side of Bristol. And the Barnes Nature Center is our community nature center. You can come during visiting hours. We have trails that are open dawn to dusk. We have lots of animals that you can come visit. And if you'd like more information about what the Environmental Learning Centers of Connecticut does, you can visit our website at elcct.org. And we look forward to seeing you. Today, I have a guest with me, Lori Fortin. Lori works for the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, DEEP. And one of the programs that she works on is the Connecticut Wildlife Rehabilitation Program. And Lori, as spring is now here, and because of that, animals are having young, they're more active. People tend to see some different species of animals more often. Some of the migratory birds are coming back. And unfortunately, sometimes people encounter animals that are in distress. They're either injured or orphaned, and people need to know what to do. So I think that's where you come in. So maybe you can tell us a little more about the wildlife program.
I'd love to. So we do have a large network of volunteers who help care for sick, injured, and orphaned animals. And all of these people have special training. They are connected with a veterinarian, and they have all of the supplies in their home that they need. So they have the right feeding tools and techniques at their disposal. They know what the correct nutrition is for the animals they care for, and they have special caging and setup that's both safe for the animals and appropriate for learning, because a lot of times they're dealing with orphaned animals that need to learn how to survive in the wild. So we have a network of about 300 people statewide. Wow. And all of them do this as volunteers, and they are fairly easy to find through our website or through calling the DEEP or getting in touch with your local nature center. There's a vast network of people that help connect the public to the rehabilitators. And it's an especially busy time of year. We're just getting into the spring, and lots of animals are being born, and unfortunately, sometimes things go wrong and they're orphaned. So before we want someone to intervene, we really want them to call either the Nature Center, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, or someone who can help guide them through the process of whether or not the animal really is an orphan.
Right. Yeah, I mean, sometimes maybe you can point out a situation where people think that the animal is orphaned and it really isn't.
So it's a little early still for rabbits, but rabbits are particularly common in people's backyards, and a lot of times they're finding a very small animal about the size of a chipmunk that is alert and active, but looks so small that they assume that it has to be an orphan, and they never usually see the adult parent nearby, so they quickly assume that animal's in distress. And it's fairly easy to capture these young animals because they're not as familiar with all the dangerous situations that they should be avoiding, and rabbits tend to freeze up, so people will just pick them up and bring them inside and assume that they can either raise it themselves or potentially bring it to someone, and a lot of times those animals really don't need help. Rabbits in particular are a species that generally won't need help unless you find it because of an accident, like a lawnmower ran over their nest, or the cat got into the nest. So that's one animal that I would say shouldn't be brought into a rehabber without some guidance.
And what about birds, the baby birds? I know at the Nature Center we get lots of calls about people finding baby birds on the ground. Should they just take them and bring them to a rehabber, or what's the protocol there?
Well, with birds, again, that'll kind of ramp up in June and July. We'll have a lot more calls. If you found a bird that's naked and cold and on the ground, that would be a cause for concern. Mm-hmm. That might be a situation where you really do want to call a rehabber and make sure that the bird gets help. And there's some triage involved in finding out if it got injured in the process of falling out of a nest. And maybe it could be reunited with the parents later, but it might need immediate help just to get it through the night or through a day or two. Okay. But later on in the summer, the birds will be in the nest and then they'll jump out of the nest. And you'll see these birds that look kind of like an adult. They have the wing feather is full, but they'll have a tiny, tiny little tail. And that's a good indicator that you found a bird that is going through a natural process of development and has jumped out of the nest. And it no longer needs the nest. The parents are around, but they're not right there with the birds at all times. They're out foraging.
Right. They're not there like teenagers almost.
Yeah, it's a learning period, and I try to explain to people that it's a very critical learning period because they're learning how to fly and they're learning how to find natural foods. And if you take it out of that environment, you're really not giving it a chance to develop the skills they really need to survive. So it's better to leave them there, even if there's a local cat or some other obstacle. The parent birds do look after them and are right around the corner, generally.
Yeah. More often than not, when we get calls, we do tell them to, if they know where the nest is, to try to get it back to that spot.
Yeah, if they still need the nest.
Yeah,
but the fledglings, sometimes they've abandoned
They're
the
not
nest.
even interested in the nest anymore.
And they're hopping around, and they might do like little short flutter flights, and then you kind of know that they're a fledgling and not a bird in distress.
So the average person really can't, or maybe they can the average person, if they find a rabbit, for example, that's injured or orphaned, can they take it home and take care of it?
No, well, legally, you're not supposed to take in wildlife without some kind of permitting.
Right.
But more importantly, you want to make sure the animal gets the best care possible. And most people don't have the right foods in their home and the right caging and materials that they need to really help an animal.
Or the experience or knowing the techniques. And
so we really want to make sure someone who has those skills and has that information gets the animal and gives it the best possible outcome at the end. When it gets released to the wild, you want to make sure the animal's ready for release.
And are there different levels of being a rehabber? How does that work? Or can everybody take care of everything? Or
So most people start out, they're working with common small mammals. So squirrels and rabbits are the two most common animals being rehabbed by anyone in the state. And if you have a general permit, you can usually work with squirrels and rabbits, opossums, woodchucks. You might work with a few non-native birds like pigeons, house sparrows, and starlings. But you're kind of limited. You're not necessarily doing everything. Other people who are interested in birds get more training, and they usually get a federal permit in addition to our state permits, so they have a specialized permit for birds. And then we also have people who work with raccoons, skunks, and foxes who are trained about how to deal with rabies and protect.
That's a whole nother story, whole nother level. Well, you recently, we, Environmental Learning Centers, recently hosted the Connecticut Wildlife Rehabilitators Association Conference at Indian Rock Preserve. And that was a great thrill for us. And you were there, and you had the opportunity to talk to a few of the people there. So let's go take a look.
We're here today at the Indian Rock Nature Preserve doing the spring meeting for the wildlife rehabilitators. My name is Lori Fortin. I work for the Wildlife Division at the DEEP, and I have been in charge of the Wildlife Rehab Program at the state level for about 20 years. I'm here today with a rehabber named Chris Clark. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Lori.
Thanks for joining me.
Oh, anytime.
And Chris has been running a store to assist rehabbers throughout the state and around the country.
Yep.
Can you tell me a little bit about when you started the store?
I started the store late 1999. I started to try to raise money for my animals and my care, and the business kind of went a little haywire on me, and here I sit,
Here you are
still
with
running
all
this
sorts
business.
of products, right?
Yep.
What kind of products are most popular this time of year?
Mostly the milk replacers, the nipples, and the syringes that we carry. The syringes are special syringes from Denmark that work very well. We carry a lot of supplements. Initially, when I started the business, I was selling a gift line for squirrel lovers because I love squirrels, and I'm not the only one that does. So we started with that, and then we got into the rehab supplies, and our pricing is all wholesale. I'm a distributor for most of the companies I work with, so I can bring on low pricing to the rehabbers, who most of them are not funded.
Right.
So every little bit helps.
And you started out as a wildlife rehabilitator.
Yes, I think I've got licensed in 1995.
Wow. So, and what do you primarily like to work with in
Squirrels.
terms of animals?
Yeah, squirrels. Done a little bit of everything over the years, but now I specialize in the squirrel.
And any highlights over the years of squirrels that you remember, or activities that stick with you?
Geez, I'm sure. I had the Herman and Samantha story, which was actually an old story on my website, which was a black squirrel and a gray squirrel, both eastern gray squirrels. And they bonded and they were released together. And we had released them, and 6 months later, the two squirrels were in the backyard playing like, oh my God, Herman, oh Samantha, we found each other. And they were playing and tumbling on the ground and having a heck of a time. And that's just one. We've had many stories.
Yeah, a lot of successes over the years.
Yeah, so we've had very good success. And now I specialize in the squirrel, so I can do a lot more for that one animal because of the knowledge I have now.
Yeah, and you have some great caging that you took a lot of time to build and design, and I know you have a good setup.
Yeah, most of our cages we've made, and they're walk-in enclosures, and we have indoor walk-in enclosures for winter and for the young ones. And I've put a lot of time into studying the animals to see what works best for success in a rehab situation. You know, the goal is for them to remain in the wild successfully.
Right. And so are there any highlights of things that you've changed over the years that have improved your success with squirrel? Hi, Dr. Sixay.
Hi.
How are you? Feels like we've done this before.
It does.
Thank you so much for coming to the wildlife rehab class today.
Happy to be here.
And I understand you're a veterinarian and you do some work with wildlife rehabilitation?
Absolutely.
And what animals do you primarily work with now?
I do have a soft spot in my heart for the birds. I did my internship in wild bird medicine and surgery, so I have probably the most experience with the wild birds. But I do like the mammals. I've grown to love working with them as well, and we'll see pretty much anything you can bring in my door.
At the clinic?
At the clinic, yeah.
And where is your clinic?
Where I'm mostly at Stone Veterinary Hospital, which is in Watertown, Connecticut.
Mm-hmm. And when you say birds, do you mean all birds, or do you mean hawks and owls, waterfowl?
I mean all birds.
All birds.
All birds. I will work on everything from a hummingbird to a swan, a loon, pelicans, everything in between.
And what kind of injuries do you see the most?
I would say it depends on the species. In the hawks and the larger birds, I'm mostly seeing wounds like gunshots and hit by cars, things like that. Actually, in eagles, the most I see is poisonings. In bald eagles, that's what I mostly see. And then in your smaller birds, window strikes, cat attacks, that kind of thing.
And the birds coming to you, they're coming with a wildlife rehabilitator mostly, not just from the general public, right?
That's ideal because I don't have a place to actually do the rehab, so I do the medical part, and then I work very closely with the rehabilitators in the area for the rehab part because they know the natural history and what is needed for housing and caging and feeding. And so we work together for me doing the medical part. So if anything's coming into my clinic, I need a place for it to go. So I need a rehabber to be able to take it home at the end of the day and do the care for it.
And I think you had an interesting case not too long ago, right, with a bald eagle. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there was a bald eagle that was found down near the Thomaston Dam and was brought in on a Saturday, I believe. Very, very dull, minimally responsive. We drew some blood, and right away I could see that the serum of the blood was very yellow, very icteric, which means that it was having some liver issues. And one of the things that is unfortunately pretty common with bald eagles is something called pentobarbital poisoning, and that's actually what veterinarians use for euthanasia solution. And it turned out that that was indeed what this bald eagle had, in part. That we were able to resolve within about 48 hours just with some fluids. But when the blood came back, this bald eagle also had significant lead and mercury in its system.
Did it survive?
It did. We were able to actually release it. I think it was a couple of months later, but it was a great success story, and we were able to release it and see it fly away, which is fantastic.
That's great. That's really what you hope for, right?
It is.
At the end of all the work and effort that's made by everybody. And I believe you worked with the Sharon Audubon Center.
Yep, they did the rehab of the bird, yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't realize what was involved, and there was all kinds of programs and everything from pathology to fixing breaks in bones and everything in between. So, and I have to remind myself all the time that these people are volunteers, essentially, that they're doing this out of their own time and their own money, basically, to help wildlife that's in distress. So my hat's off to them. It's really a great thing, and for us at the Nature Center, it's very helpful too, because we do get calls a lot, and we don't do wildlife rehabilitation at ELCCT, but we have the network that we can call, and we can get people to help us out and help us direct some of these issues that come up. So it's a really great thing. Unfortunately, sometimes animals, when they're rescued, they can't be released into the wild. And so who do we have here on your glove?
Well, Kira is an eastern screech owl, and she lives mostly at the Barnes Nature Center in Bristol, so you are familiar with her. But she's a good ambassador for her species and for others. She was found in the backyard at a young age, and the people who found her really thought they could help her and didn't call a rehabber, and they took her in and spent a lot of time with her in their home. And she got really more accustomed to being with people, which is why she's not too upset about sitting here on my hand. And because of that, she really isn't a good candidate for release back into the wild.
Why is that?
Well, she is what we're calling imprinted. She's learned to associate herself with humans instead of owls. So she really doesn't know all the skills she needs to know. And in the wild, she wouldn't even recognize an owl of her species as being a like owl. So she would not reproduce in the wild. She might have conflicts with other owls that shouldn't be conflicts. And she's just not going to respond naturally or normally to a wild setting. So her chances of survival in the wild are extremely low and not good enough to really risk letting her go. She might live a couple of days, tops, and
so
die.
Not being able to hunt or ward off predators or
not being able to recognize food that should be found in the wild. So.
And are eastern screech owls indigenous to our area?
They are quite common. They're so small that people overlook them, and they're fairly secretive. So unless you heard one, you really wouldn't even know they were there. They make a very interesting call, which I don't know if you can duplicate.
Not really.
But it sounds more like a whinny, and It's kind of an eerie sound, not the traditional hooting of an owl
Right.
that you would expect.
But it's not really a aggressive screech either, is it?
No, they have a variety of calls though, and some might be a little higher pitched than others. But it's definitely some interesting sounds that people would never associate with an owl, so it's kind of an interesting.
Yeah.
But they do like more of a shrubby landscape. They're not really an owl that you'd find in the deep woods or in a just wide open field. So they like a little bit of a mixture of shrubs, junipers in particular.
Kind of an edge between the forest and,
And they really did well around farms because you'd often find like some shrubby scrub around the fields of the farm.
Yeah.
So a little bit more of a mix of habitat and not some, not like a large, vast forest. It wouldn't be their traditional habitat.
And I'm watching it, looking around and trying to get used to its surroundings here, turning its head. Can it turn its head all the way around? Some people think.
That's a great misconception, but they do have 2 extra vertebrae more than we do in their neck, and that allows them to turn their head 270 degrees, I believe, around. So it almost looks like their head is spinning if they turn their head quickly back and forth. And they do that because they can't move their eyes. Mm-hmm. So you could look ahead and kind of look at me through your peripheral vision. This bird can't do that. Their eyes are fixed, so they're only looking in one direction all the time.
And they have really big eyes, too, where you can even tell you're only looking at a small portion of the eyes on her face there. And it takes up a lot of space in the head cavity.
Well, sight and hearing are very important for the species to find food at night in the dark, sometimes in complete darkness. So they do have excellent vision, but they also have excellent hearing, so that they can find their food at night.
Yeah, I've heard that they can even find their food without seeing it, just by hearing it.
Yeah, they do have very tiny little openings on the side of their head, kind of in the little dish of feathers, and the sound just gets funneled right into the ear canal so efficiently that they can hear every little sound.
And I'm sure there's some people watching now that are saying, well, she's pointing to her face. The ears are up on top of her head there.
Right. But those aren't even ears.
No.
They're just feathers that help the bird to be camouflaged when they're up against a tree.
I always say it just makes them look cool.
Yeah. Well, they also think that those feathers are unique enough that individual owls can tell each other apart by their feathers alone, the ear tufts alone.
Yeah.
But not every owl species has those feathers on the top of their head, those ear tufts. Right. So something like a barred owl does not have that.
And this is a full-grown eastern screech owl?
It is, and it is not the smallest owl you will find in Connecticut, but very close. Mm-hmm. We also have a saw-whet owl. Northern saw-whet owls are just a tiny little bit smaller.
And they don't have those feather tufts.
And they don't have that. And this bird is particularly fun to look at up close because you rarely see an owl with much coloration.
Right.
They're usually
mostly
brown.
gray or brown or kind of drab looking.
Yeah, and these are just a beautiful kind of brick red that is a unique color. They do come in 2 color phases, so you see them in gray or in this kind of reddish pattern. And I think we have a fairly equal distribution of those 2 colors in our state.
The theory, I guess, is that the strain that's red, the variation that's red, initially came from areas where they had red pines, and so they were able to camouflage themselves up against those red pines. And the other gray phase came from areas that have more of the oaks and the ashes, which have the gray bark, and they're able to camouflage themselves up against that. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that. That's interesting.
What do they eat in the wild?
Actually, they eat mostly insects. So in the summer, they need those open fields and foraging areas to eat grasshoppers and crickets and other insects. And they usually have their young at a time of year when insects are plentiful, because that's the easiest and most nutritious food source really for their young. In the winter, they don't have that option. They will stay here through the winter, so they're going to eat tiny mice and voles that are, around that they can get to if the snow cover is really deep.
Right. So they do
Sometimes
eat
they can't.
the rodents and things too, but they
Yep.
prefer the insects, which is interesting because you think of owls, birds of prey, as these aggressive, birds coming down and taking rodents and rabbits and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
And you don't think too much about the insects.
This guy is definitely not going to take a rabbit.
No, I
unless
would
it's
say
just
not.
a very young rabbit.
So we're running out of time here, but before we go, I just wanted to, if people are interested in either becoming a wildlife rehabilitator or they would like to know who they should call if they find an animal in distress, who should they contact?
Well, the DEEP Wildlife Division phone number is 860-424-3011, and that's answered Monday through Friday. So if it's an emergency on a night or weekend, they can look up a directory in our website of rehabilitators, or they could call the emergency hotline for the agency, which is 860-424-3333, which is fairly easy to remember.
And for someone who wants to become a wildlife rehabilitator, go through the training and the classes and all that's involved on the website as well?
Yeah, the website has a lot of information. It has my email address, and most people, if they contact me by email, I can get them into the class. We only have a class once a year because we get so busy dealing with calls and emergencies the rest of the year. So that's going to happen next year in February or March. So people could volunteer at local facilities this summer, but they won't really be able to get the class hours until next winter.
Okay. Well, it's certainly something to think about, and it's a rewarding pastime or hobby or whatever whatever you would call it. And I would call it a profession, actually, because it's very technical. And
it is.
Yeah.
I would just mention that last year, rehabbers handled about 13,000 animals. That's a lot of animals.
Just in the state of Connecticut.
Just in the state of Connecticut. And a very small number end up in educational facilities like this bird.
Right.
A very high number, about 70%, get released back into the wild.
Right, most get released in the wild. Well, thank you, Lori, for being here today. We really appreciate it. It's very, very interesting. It's nice to meet Kira, the owl here. And folks, we're out of time. We hope to see you next time here. And in the meantime, keep your eyes on nature.